As we know, there's various pots of funding available. We have the levy, AB, ESF. Does the panel think that there is something that can be done to bring it all together?
So I think, and it's certainly something, Gordon, you alluded to. The levy funding has been, I guess, very positive, but it is quite specific. Do you think there should be a wider skills fund? Or how would that work? You obviously think that you could broaden the levy fund out a bit, but what's your view about all of the government funds? Should there be one fund?
Well, of course, it's easy to say one thing in opposition, and probably rather more difficult to say the same thing when you're sitting in a ministerial chair. But the serious point is, it is this eternal conflict between wanting to understand that the skills market is a highly complex area, and therefore you do need to have different funding streams, but at the same time also realizing that it's a very malleable and a very fast-moving area, but at the same time not wanting to have too much micromanagement with the administration that comes along with that. I do think it is genuinely a very, very difficult balance to make. I'm going to just not duck the question, but answer it a little bit sideways, because actually one of those funding streams that you mentioned, I think you mentioned ESF, didn't you? Yes, well, what's going to happen to ESF? I mean, we've been promised by the government this rather sort of, I can't even remember what it's called. It's a fairly Orwellian name, like Fund of National Prosperity or something, but we haven't seen any. This of course, is supposed to replace the funding post-Brexit, which is coming through, and of course, which has a really big impact, both in the FE area, but also actually in the HE area. I mean, a lot of post-92 universities are very concerned about that. I'm not going to go off on a Brexit theme, but I'm just saying that that is an illustration of how funding changes and how it moves. The other thing, of course, is the nature of skills themselves. I mean, perhaps just to turn the question around, the nature of the skills themselves are changing very rapidly and very radically. This is one of the things in our, as you probably know, slight plug coming up here, the Labour Party has embarked on this process of setting up a national education service. And one of the things that we have said in that process and the charter that has come forward is that we really have to look very carefully at structures that will last into the 2030s. And the nature of skills at the moment, it seems to me, talking to other people, is quite paradoxical, because on the one hand, more and more employers, and certainly surveys are bearing this out, more and more employers are wanting generic skills. I'm not going to call them soft skills. I don't like calling them soft skills because I think that sometimes devalues them. But they're nevertheless, and this applies in apprenticeships as well as other skills qualifications. So they're wanting more and more of that because they know that they're going to train and want to retain, if they can, people may move on, people whose abilities they will need to use in different circumstances if they want over a 5 or 10 year period. And that, of course, goes for the individuals themselves who may not want to stay with the same employer for more than 5 or 10 years. So you've got that on the one hand. At the same time, you've got a situation where, because of the rapid movement in technology and automation and a whole range of other things in particular areas, more and more short-term bespoke skills to deal with technical developments, with the jobs that people do or with the training that they're doing, are coming on board. So we've got this paradox. If you're looking at it from a governmental point of view or even from a devolved administration point of view, we've got to put money into thinking quite hard about generic skills, but we've also got to address some of the short-term issues in terms of that. We believe that that can only be done by having a much broader overall framework of structure for funding, which we would do under our National Education Service, that would enable that money to follow the needs that are coming along. Now, how that would impact on the sort of variety of things that you've been talking about, adult skills funding and ESFA, is something we would work out in government. But I am very confident and sure that what is going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years in the skills market will radically alter the view of what sort of skills that we need, and that will have implications for the funding structures.
Excellent. Thanks very much. Graham, you presumably deliver quite a number of these different... How did...
24 years into FE, I've seen, I think, as many funding streams as there has been. But the same thing always applies. Is it an eligible learner on an eligible programme? And if you look at all the funding streams that have been in existence since I've been in FE, the same principles apply. The problem is the bureaucracy associated with demonstrating you have an eligible learner and demonstrating they're on an eligible programme is too great. So it's not really about how many funding streams there are, but the bureaucracy associated with drawing down the money to be able to sustain yourself as a provider business delivering these programs. So I worry less about the different ranges, but more about the money I have to spend in being able to meet the needs of these funding streams. So yes, in a utopia world, wouldn't it be nice to have one stream? But actually the sources of this funding are different. Europe, employers, so no one's going to allow, I don't believe anyone's going to allow that to happen. It'd be too complicated. But I just want the bureaucracy associated with that to come down. And actually, greater trust in the system.
Well, I think the word trust has been used a couple of times now. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, these years, when I was in AELP as chief exec, we tried to introduce a trust regime, one that depended on the professionalism of the training provider to integrate the various programs. It was perhaps an ideal before its time, but genuinely, I think we haven't got quite the balance. So there's now controls over literally everything, and perhaps shifting the balance. You deal with all sorts of different funding regimes.
I don't know if you remember, actually, Stuart, I came to a ALP dinner about a year ago, and I think one of the topics I talked about then, and only got a lukewarm response at the time, was should it be...
I did tell you.
You did? I was being a bit brave, maybe, or stupid at the time, but I did say, should we be talking about a skills levy? And I suppose it's interesting, isn't it? That was my view, probably not that considered at that moment in time, because I suppose rather naively I was trying to think, how can we find a way to unlock some of the things we've been talking about? And I still believe a skills levy, as long as it's not at the cost of the apprenticeship system, would have some merit. And I think about all the things that you as employers have to think about: the administration burden, the mentors that we might want, the careers advisors, the work experience coming in from T-levels. If we were really sensible at how we segmented some of this money, and we had trust in the system, and the ecosystem was allowed to flow around it, we might get some really sensible, joined up, valued funding streams working together. And my very last point on why I think is, we've mentioned about the fact, let's not go back to the Treasury. It goes to the Treasury, we'll never see it again. So if this is our opportunity of getting hold of it and getting the system to work with it in a meaningful way to get real change to happen, look, I think it should be a skills levy.
Yeah, the day the Treasury get their money back will be the day that, you can imagine the pressure that they will, we gave you the money and you didn't even spend that. So genuinely, it's a serious point. It's a serious point, and we can't let that happen, and I trust that all training advisors will be out there making sure that employers spend their money effectively.